The message arrived as dawn painted the eastern walls of the palace in shades of rose and gold, carried by a servant girl whose eyes refused to meet hers. Lyra turned the parchment over in her hands, noting the expensive paper and formal seal that bore the crest of the royal council. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she read the summons once, then twice, unable to believe the words written in flowing script across the cream-coloured surface. You are requested to attend a private meeting regarding matters of supernatural lineage verification at the Thornwood Grove. Come alone, dawn, 3 days hence. The signature was illegible, but the seal was unmistakably official. Lyra had spent enough time cleaning the council chambers to recognise the deep indentations of authentic royal correspondence. But why would the council want to meet with her? She was nobody, a servant girl whose only claim to anything remotely supernatural was the strange dreams that had been plaguing her sleep for weeks, dreams of silver light and ancient voices calling her name. She tucked the message inside her worn leather bodice and continued with her morning duties, scrubbing floors and hauling water as if nothing had changed. But everything felt different now. The familiar weight of the bucket seemed lighter in her hands, and she found herself moving through the corridors with an odd sense of anticipation that made her skin prickle with nervous energy. 3 days passed in a blur of routine tasks and sleepless nights. Lyra found herself touching the hidden message repeatedly, reassuring herself it was real and not some elaborate joke at her expense. The other servants noticed her distraction, offering teasing comments about her sudden dreaminess, but she deflected their questions with forced laughter and quickly changed subjects. The night before the meeting, she lay awake staring at the wooden beams of the servants' quarters ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of the other girls around her. Something was stirring inside her chest, a restless energy that made her feel like her skin was too tight for whatever was growing beneath it. Her wolf, if she even had one, felt agitated in a way that had never happened before, pacing somewhere deep inside her consciousness like a caged animal sensing freedom. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly all at once. Lyra slipped from her narrow bed before the other servants woke, dressing in her cleanest work dress and braiding her long dark hair into a practical plait down her back. She left a note claiming sudden illness, knowing the head cook would dock her wages, but hoping the meeting would somehow make such concerns irrelevant. The rational part of her mind whispered warnings about naivety and false hope, but the growing restlessness in her chest drowned out caution with desperate curiosity. The Thornwood Grove lay a mile beyond the palace walls, accessible by a winding path through dense forest that most avoided after dark. Ancient oak and ash trees formed a natural cathedral, their branches so thick they blocked most of the morning light and cast everything in deep green shadows. Lyra had been there once before as a child, drawn by stories of old magic, but had fled when the whispers seemed to follow her deeper into the trees. Now the whispers were back, but they sounded almost welcoming. She pushed through the undergrowth, following the barely visible trail toward the heart of the grove, where a circle of standing stones marked the oldest part of the forest. Her enhanced hearing, when had that started, caught the sound of movement ahead, multiple footsteps trying to move quietly through dead leaves and snapping twigs. Relief flooded through her as she realized she wasn't the only one who had received the summons. But relief turned to ice-cold terror when she stepped into the stone circle and saw the faces waiting for her. They weren't council members. They weren't even palace officials. The 6 figures arranged around the ancient stones wore dark hunting leathers and carried weapons that gleamed with the distinctive silver sheen used specifically for killing supernatural beings. Their faces were hidden behind black masks, but she recognized the predatory stillness of trained killers preparing to strike. "Well, well," said the tallest figure, his voice carrying the accent of the Eastern Territories, where rebellion had been simmering for months. The little mongrel actually came. Lyra's newly awakened instincts screamed danger so loudly that her vision sharpened to preternatural clarity. She could smell their intent like acid in the air, violence, death, and something else that made her wolf whimper in the depths of her mind: fear. They were afraid of her, which made no sense because she was just a servant girl with no training and no weapons. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, backing toward the tree line with careful steps. "I was supposed to meet council members about your bloodline." The leader's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Oh, we know exactly what bloodline you carry, little princess. That's why you have to die." The world slowed as 6 silver blades cleared their sheaths in perfect synchronization. Lyra's body reacted before her mind could process the threat, diving sideways behind one of the standing stones as the first crossbow bolt shattered the ancient rock where her head had been a heartbeat before. Granite dust and stone fragments rained down around her as she pressed herself against the cold surface, trying to make sense of what was happening. Bloodline, princess. They knew something about her that she didn't know about herself. "She's faster than the reports indicated," called another voice from across the circle. "And her reflexes are already enhanced. The awakening must be accelerating." Awakening. The word sent lightning through her nervous system, connecting to something buried deep in her genetic memory. Images flashed through her mind: silver light, golden eyes, fangs and claws and power that could reshape kingdoms. Ancient voices whispered forgotten names, and for one terrifying moment she felt something vast and predatory stirring inside her chest. "Ah, spread out!" the leader commanded. "She can't have learned to shift yet, but don't take any chances. Silver to the heart and head. Make it quick." Lyra's newly enhanced hearing tracked their movements around the grove with impossible precision. 3 moving clockwise, 3 counterclockwise, closing the circle until she would have nowhere to run. The rational part of her mind catalogued her options and found them uniformly hopeless. She was outnumbered, out-armed, and trapped in terrain that favoured the hunters. But the other part of her mind, the part that was growing stronger with each passing second, began to whisper different possibilities. She could smell their individual scents now, could hear their heartbeats and distinguish the subtle differences in their breathing patterns. The one approaching from her left had a slight limp that would slow his reaction time. The female archer, positioning herself near the eastern edge of the circle, favoured her right side and would telegraph her shots. The leader's confidence was a weakness because he expected her to behave like prey. What if she didn't? The first attacker rounded her stone with silver blade raised, expecting to find a cowering servant girl. Instead, he found empty space and the whisper of movement behind him. Lyra's enhanced speed carried her inside his guard before he could react, her hands finding the pressure points at his neck with knowledge she didn't remember learning. He dropped like a felled tree, alive but unconscious. "She's faster than anticipated," the female archer called out, already drawing her bow. "Abilities are manifesting under stress." The silver-tipped arrow hummed through the air where Lyra had been standing, but she was already moving, using the standing stones as cover, while her mind raced to understand what was happening to her body. Strength flowed through muscles that had never felt this kind of power, and her senses were so acute that she could track each assassin's position by scent and sound alone. Another attacker emerged from behind the central stone, moving with the fluid grace of a trained killer. But Lyra moved like something else entirely, like liquid shadow with lethal intent. She ducked his horizontal slash, swept his legs, and relieved him of his weapon in one flowing motion that felt as natural as breathing. The silver blade burned against her palm, but she ignored the pain and kept moving. "Impossible," breathed the leader, but his voice now carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The bloodline was supposed to be dormant, completely suppressed. "Well, it's not dormant now," snarled the remaining conscious assassin, launching himself at her with twin daggers that caught the filtered sunlight like falling stars. Lyra met his attack with the stolen blade, muscle memory she'd never earned guiding her parries and counterstrikes. The silver burned her hands with every contact, but the pain seemed distant compared to the exhilaration flooding her system. This was what she was built for, not scrubbing floors and hauling water, but this deadly dance where every movement mattered and hesitation meant death. She disarmed him with a twist of her wrist that sent one dagger spinning into the underbrush, then followed up with an elbow strike that dropped him beside his unconscious companion. 4 down, 2 to go. "Enough games," the leader growled, producing a crossbow of his own while the female archer flanked to the right. "Royal bloodline or not, you're still just one girl against superior firepower." But as he raised the weapon, something changed in the air around the grove. The ancient stones began to hum with a frequency that made Lyra's bones vibrate, and the whispers of old magic grew strong enough that even the assassins could hear them. Power was waking up in this place, power that recognized her and responded to her presence. The crossbow bolt left the string with deadly accuracy, aimed directly at her heart. Lyra moved without conscious thought, her body twisting impossibly fast as silver light erupted from her skin like internal fire. The bolt passed through empty air while she completed her evasive spin, and when she came to rest, the light continued to pour from her hands and eyes like liquid starshine. The female archer's weapon fell from nerveless fingers as she stared at the supernatural radiance flowing around the girl she'd been sent to kill. "Ancient bloodline," she whispered, backing toward the tree line, with sudden terror replacing professional confidence. "She's not just supernatural, she's old blood, royal guardian stock." The leader's mask had slipped, revealing a scarred face twisted with fanatic determination. "Then we die here, but so does she. The Eastern Alliance won't tolerate a guardian awakening, not after what her kind did to our territories." He dropped the crossbow and drew a long silver sword that gleamed with malevolent purpose, advancing on Lyra with the grim resolve of someone choosing death over failure. But as he raised the blade for a killing stroke, the grove itself seemed to intervene. Ancient root systems erupted from the earth around his feet, wrapping around his ankles and wrists with the speed of striking serpents. The female archer screamed as similar roots dragged her weapons from her hands and pinned her against the nearest oak tree. In seconds, both remaining assassins were completely immobilized by the forest itself, held fast by magic that responded to royal blood. Lyra stood in the center of the stone circle, silver light still flowing from her skin as she stared at her trapped would-be killers. The power coursing through her felt natural and terrifying in equal measure, like remembering something that had been deliberately forgotten. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the leaves whisper in response. The leader spat toward her feet, defiance burning in his eyes despite his helpless position. "The Eastern Coalition knows what you are, Guardian Spawn. They know what happens when your kind fully awakens. We were sent to prevent that." "Prevent what?" "The return of the old power structures, the restoration of the ancient bloodlines, the end of the current political balance that keeps the Eastern territories free from royal supernatural oversight." The female archer found her voice, though it shook with obvious terror. "You don't understand what you are, do you? They've kept you ignorant, made you think you were just a servant. But we have records, girl. We know what the Guardian bloodlines could do before they were suppressed. We know what you'll become if you complete the awakening." Lyra felt the truth of their words resonating in her bones, connecting to genetic memories that had been locked away for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Whatever she was becoming, it was significant enough that people were willing to commit murder to prevent it. The silver light gradually faded from her skin as the immediate danger passed, but the power remained, humming just beneath the surface like a sleeping dragon. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors just hours ago, and saw faint silver lines traced across her palms like ritual markings. This was all planned, she realized aloud. The message, the location, the timing. Someone wanted me here when my abilities were starting to manifest. Someone who knew exactly what would trigger the awakening. The leader's expression shifted from defiance to grudging respect. Cleverly done, I'll give them that. Force a crisis that requires you to access your power. Let the assassins confirm your bloodline status, then leave the Grove's ancient magic to handle the cleanup. But who? Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest, growing rapidly closer. Multiple riders were coming fast, drawn by sounds of combat or some other signal Lyra hadn't noticed. She tensed, preparing to run or fight as circumstances demanded, but something about the approaching presence felt different from the hostile energy of the assassins. It felt like recognition, like something calling to its mate. The silver light began to glow beneath her skin again, responding to whatever was coming through the trees with eager anticipation that made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. Whatever was approaching, her newly awakened power welcomed it with the desperate relief of finding something that had been missing. The hoofbeats were almost at the grove now, and Lyra realized that her real story, whatever that might be, was about to begin. The great hall of the palace had never witnessed anything like the assembly that convened 3 days after the battle at Moonhaven Grove. Representatives from every major territory filled the ancient chamber, their presence creating a tapestry of supernatural power and political authority that had not gathered in one place since the Great Suppression ended centuries of Guardian Alpha partnerships. Lyra entered the hall in her transformed state, power radiating from her awakened form like captured starlight, while the mate bond connecting her to Kieran blazed with intensity that made every supernatural being present acknowledge their partnership as fundamental truth beyond political negotiation. She wore the ancestral jewelry that had triggered her awakening, silver that seemed to move and flow like liquid metal, responding to her guardian heritage with recognition that transcended ordinary craftsmanship. Lords and ladies of the assembled territories, Kieran began, his alpha authority amplified by their bond to levels that commanded immediate attention from every political leader present. We gather today to witness the formal dissolution of arrangements that were made under incomplete understanding of the supernatural forces involved. At the centre of the hall, Lady Celeste stood with dignity that had been transformed by her experience at Moonhaven Grove. The woman who had led assassination attempts against Guardian bloodlines now wore the expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about power and authority had been challenged and found wanting. The Eastern Alliance formally withdraws all claims regarding the previously negotiated political marriage, she announced, her voice carrying across the chamber with clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. After witnessing Guardian power demonstrated in sacred space, we acknowledge that mate bonds take precedence over territorial convenience. The formal language couldn't disguise the magnitude of what she was conceding. Political marriages between Alpha Kings and territorial nobility had been the foundation of supernatural diplomacy for 3 centuries, creating the alliance networks that maintained peace through carefully balanced obligations and shared interests. More than that, Celeste continued, her gaze finding Lyra among the assembled dignitaries. The Alliance formally recognises Guardian royal bloodlines as legitimate supernatural authority with ancestral rights to partnership with Alpha leadership. A murmur of shock rippled through the hall as the implications of that statement became clear. Royal recognition meant legal standing, territorial rights, and political authority that extended far beyond personal relationships between mated pairs. Oracle Thane stepped forward from his position among the council elders, his ancient form carrying scrolls and documents that detailed the constitutional foundations of Guardian Alpha governance during the pre-suppression period. The historical precedent is clear, he announced, his voice resonating with the authority of someone who had devoted his life to preserving suppressed knowledge. Guardian queens held royal status equal to Alpha kings during the ancient period, with complementary rather than competing authority over territorial governance. The documents he displayed revealed the legal framework that had once governed supernatural society, laws that recognize guardian bloodlines as natural partners to Alpha authority, with specific provisions for shared rule that enhanced rather than divided territorial power. "What does this mean practically?" asked Lord Commander Valdris, who had remained notably absent from the assassination attempts that had cost the Alliance so much credibility. "How does Guardian restoration affect existing territorial agreements and trade relationships?" "It means," Lyra said, stepping forward with supernatural grace that made the ancient stones of the hall sing in harmonic response, "that 17 awakening Guardian bloodlines will be seeking partnerships with Alpha leaders across territories that have been struggling with political instability for generations." Through her enhanced awareness, she could perceive the truth of that statement in ways that transcended mere political calculation. The territories represented in this assembly had been dealing with constant border disputes, resource allocation conflicts, and succession crises that had grown worse with each passing decade. Guardian abilities include supernatural senses that can detect deception in trade negotiations, enhanced tactical awareness that improves military planning, and most importantly, the power to strengthen mate bonds throughout the general population in ways that increase supernatural birth rates and genetic stability. The last point struck the assembled leaders with particular force, as declining supernatural birth rates had been a source of growing concern across multiple territories. If Guardian restoration could address demographic challenges while also providing political stability, the benefits would extend far beyond immediate alliance considerations. "The Northern Territories have been dealing with succession disputes for 3 years," admitted Lady Morwyn of House Ironwood, her political pragmatism overriding whatever reservations she might have had about bloodline restoration. "If Guardian partnership could provide the kind of stability you're describing, we would welcome formal negotiations." Similar expressions of interest began emerging from other territorial representatives as the practical benefits of Guardian Alpha partnerships became clear. These weren't leaders driven by romantic sentiment. They were calculating political advantages that could address real problems their territories had been facing since the Great Suppression eliminated the supernatural balance that had once maintained peace. "What about the awakening process?" asked Lord Commander Valdris with the directness of someone accustomed to military planning. "How do we safely integrate Guardian bloodlines that have been dormant for centuries without destabilizing existing power structures?" Oracle Thane moved to another section of his documents, revealing detailed protocols for managed awakening that had been developed during the ancient period when Guardian abilities first manifested in the general population. "Guardian queens can trigger controlled awakening in suppressed bloodlines through direct contact," he explained. "The process requires willing participation from both the dormant Guardian and the intended Alpha partner, ensuring that partnerships form through natural compatibility rather than political coercion." "And if Guardian bloodlines choose not to awaken," Lady Celeste asked, "if they prefer to remain in their current circumstances rather than accept royal responsibilities?" "Then they remain exactly as they are," Lyra replied, with conviction that made her supernatural authority resonate through the hall. "Guardian power cannot be forced on unwilling recipients. Awakening requires conscious choice to accept abilities that come with significant responsibilities." The assembled leaders began to recognize the careful balance that Guardian restoration offered, enhanced power and stability for those who chose to participate, with no coercion for those who preferred their current circumstances. It was an approach that respected individual autonomy while addressing collective needs. The formal ceremony, Kieran announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone making decisions that would echo through supernatural history, "will acknowledge the mate bond between myself and Lady Lyra of House Shadowmere, with full recognition of her royal status as Guardian Queen and equal partner in territorial governance." The title resonated through the Great Hall with power that made the ancient stones themselves respond with recognition. Guardian Queen, not consort, not political bride, but royal partner with authority derived from supernatural heritage rather than marriage convenience. Furthermore, he continued, the ceremony will include formal recognition of guardian bloodline restoration as beneficial rather than threatening to territorial stability, with provisions for managed awakening programs that allow other suppressed families to choose their level of participation. As the political implications settled into place, Lyra felt the mate bond pulsing with satisfaction that extended far beyond personal happiness. What they were creating wasn't just a marriage, it was the foundation for supernatural society's return to the balanced governance that had been lost during the Great Suppression. The ceremony will take place at the next full moon, Oracle Thane announced, consulting astronomical charts that connected the timing to optimal conditions for supernatural bonding rituals. Sacred timing that will enhance the bond's effectiveness and provide maximum stability for territorial partnership. 2 weeks to prepare, Kieran said, his tactical mind already calculating the logistics of an event that would reshape supernatural politics across every territory represented in the hall. Enough time for formal invitations, security arrangements, and the kind of diplomatic coordination that events of this magnitude require. But as the assembly began to disperse, with leaders already discussing the implications of what they had witnessed, Lyra felt her enhanced awareness detecting undercurrents of resistance that formal recognition couldn't entirely eliminate. Not everyone in the hall was convinced that Guardian restoration represented beneficial change. Some territorial leaders were calculating ways to profit from continued instability, while others genuinely feared that enhanced supernatural abilities would create power imbalances they couldn't control. The public ceremony would be magnificent, but it would also be a target for anyone who viewed Guardian Alpha partnership as a threat to their existing advantages. The real test of their restored bond would come when enemies who couldn't be swayed by demonstration of mercy decided to make their opposition known through more direct means. The first formal council meeting of the new reign convened in chambers that had been redesigned to accommodate the reality of dual royal authority, with thrones positioned as equals rather than the traditional single seat of alpha power, flanked by ceremonial positions for advisors and consorts. Lyra took her place beside Kieran with supernatural grace that made the ancient stones sing in recognition of Guardian Queen authority restored after 3 centuries of absence. The northern border disputes, she began, her enhanced senses providing tactical information that no purely human analysis could have achieved, are being deliberately prolonged by merchants who profit from the instability. I can perceive the deception in their reports about resource scarcity and territorial violations. Through their mate bond, Kieran felt her awareness expanding to encompass layers of political manipulation that had been invisible to conventional intelligence gathering. Guardian abilities included supernatural perception that could detect falsehood with the same accuracy that enhanced hearing could identify individual voices in a crowd. Name the specific merchants, he said, his alpha authority backed by her supernatural insights, creating a combination that made resistance to royal decree practically impossible. Within an hour, they had identified 17 different commercial interests that had been manufacturing board attentions to maintain profitable black market operations. More importantly, they had developed solutions that addressed the underlying economic pressures while eliminating the artificial conflicts that had destabilized the region for years. This is how it worked during the ancient period, Oracle Thane observed from his position among the council advisors. Guardian senses detecting problems that Alpha Authority could resolve directly, creating efficiency in governance that made territorial administration almost effortless. The afternoon session focused on military reorganization, where Lyra's awakened abilities provided strategic insights that revolutionized their approach to kingdom defense. Through her connection to other awakening Guardian bloodlines, she could establish communication networks that spanned impossible distances, coordinate tactical responses across multiple territories, and most importantly, detect supernatural threats before they manifested into active dangers. The Eastern Territories are experiencing rogue pack activity, she reported, her consciousness touching the awakening guardian line of House Stormwind, whose enhanced senses were tracking the supernatural disturbances. Wolves who have been artificially enhanced with the same alchemical processes the Alliance used on their soldiers. Numbers and location? Kieran asked, his tactical mind immediately shifting into military planning mode. 47 enhanced rogues moving in coordinated packs through the Thornwood region. But they're not acting randomly. Someone is directing their movements toward population centres that would maximise civilian casualties. The implications struck the entire council simultaneously. Rogue packs enhanced with artificial abilities represented a threat that conventional military forces couldn't address effectively, while their targeting of civilian areas suggested political motivation rather than simple territorial aggression. Alliance remnants, Lord Commander Valdris concluded grimly. The factions that refuse to accept Guardian restoration are using enhanced rogues as proxy forces to destabilize territories that have embraced bloodline partnerships. Through her expanded awareness, Lyra could sense the broader pattern of coordinated attacks being planned across multiple regions. The formal recognition of Guardian authority had triggered desperate responses from political interests that benefited from the instability that Guardian Alpha partnerships were designed to eliminate. "We need to address this directly," she said, allowing her power to manifest visibly as silver light that illuminated the council chamber. Enhanced rogues respond to supernatural dominance hierarchies. If I confront them in my awakened form, backed by your Alpha authority, we can break their artificial loyalty to whoever is controlling them. Too dangerous, Kieran replied immediately, his protective instincts responding to any suggestion that would place his mate in unnecessary peril. Enhanced rogues with artificial abilities are unpredictable. We don't know how they'll respond to Guardian Queen authority. Which is exactly why we need to find out now, while we can control the circumstances of the encounter, Lyra countered, with logic that her enhanced tactical awareness made irrefutable. If we allow them to attack civilian targets, we'll be responding to crises instead of preventing them. The debate continued through the afternoon as they developed protocols for addressing enhanced rogue threats while minimising risks to Guardian Queen's safety. But the deeper issue was the recognition that Guardian restoration had triggered opposition that extended beyond formal political channels into irregular warfare designed to prove that supernatural partnerships couldn't provide the security they promised. By evening, they had established new defensive networks that combined Guardian sensory capabilities with Alpha military authority, creating early warning systems that could detect supernatural threats across vast territorial ranges. More importantly, they had begun training programs that would allow conventional forces to work effectively alongside awakened bloodlines whose abilities exceeded baseline human limitations. The legal reforms, Oracle Thane announced as the formal session concluded, presenting documents that addressed the constitutional challenges created by Guardian restoration. Laws that protect awakening bloodlines from coercion while establishing frameworks for voluntary participation in territorial governance. The legislation was complex, balancing individual rights with collective security needs while providing legal recognition for supernatural abilities that conventional jurisprudence had never been designed to address. Most importantly, it established protection for Guardian families who chose to remain dormant, while ensuring that awakened bloodlines received support for abilities that carried significant responsibilities. This prevents forced awakening, Lyra explained, as she reviewed the proposed statutes with supernatural perception that could detect potential loopholes or unintended consequences. And it prevents discrimination against families who carry Guardian heritage but prefer their current circumstances. It also establishes protocols for managed awakening programs, Kieran added, his understanding of the political implications enhanced by their mate-bond connection. voluntary processes that allow interested families to explore their heritage with appropriate support and guidance. As the council dispersed, Lyra felt the satisfaction of witnessing governance that actually addressed problems rather than merely managing symptoms. The combination of guardian senses and alpha authority created efficiency in administration that made complex territorial challenges seem almost effortless to resolve. But through her enhanced awareness, she could also perceive the growing coordination among resistant factions who viewed effective governance as a threat to their existing advantages. The enhanced rogue attacks were just the beginning of a campaign designed to prove that Guardian restoration destabilized rather than strengthened territorial security. "They're going to escalate," she said quietly as she and Kieran reviewed intelligence reports in their private chambers. "The factions that profit from instability won't accept that Guardian Alpha partnerships actually work. They'll manufacture crises to justify their opposition. Then we demonstrate that our partnership can handle whatever they create," Kieran replied, his confidence backed by weeks of training that had proven their tactical coordination exceeded anything in recorded supernatural history. Through the mate bond, they both understood that their success in governance was creating new challenges. Effective leadership threatened the power bases of interests that had thrived during centuries of managed conflict and artificial scarcity. Those interests would fight back with increasing desperation as Guardian restoration proved its benefits. But they had also proven that some bonds were stronger than political opposition, some abilities were more fundamental than artificial enhancement, and some partnerships were worth defending regardless of the cost their enemies were willing to pay to destroy them. The new order was working, which meant their real battles were just beginning. 6 months after the mate bond ceremony that had restored Guardian Alpha partnership to the supernatural world, Lyra stood on the palace balcony overlooking territories that had been transformed by the return of ancient bloodline balance. The evening sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, illuminating a kingdom that thrived under dual royal authority in ways that had seemed impossible during the dark centuries of the Great Suppression. Through her enhanced senses, she could perceive the broader changes that Guardian restoration had brought to the supernatural world. 17 awakened bloodlines now worked in partnership with alpha leaders across territories that had struggled with instability for generations, their combined abilities creating governance so effective that border disputes had virtually disappeared. Trade negotiations proceeded with supernatural efficiency when Guardian senses could detect deception, while military coordination reached unprecedented levels through telepathic communication networks that spanned vast distances. More than any external changes, though, was the life growing within her, an heir whose supernatural potential already blazed with intensity that made her awakened abilities seem modest by comparison. Through their mate bond, she could feel Kieran's wonder and protective pride whenever he sensed their unborn child's remarkable power, abilities that represented the next evolutionary step in Guardian Alpha genetics. The birth rates have increased by 30% across all territories with Guardian partnerships, Oracle Thane reported as he joined her on the balcony, his ancient form moving with satisfaction that came from witnessing prophecies fulfilled and bloodlines restored. "The supernatural world is healing from 3 centuries of artificial imbalance." Lyra nodded, her enhanced awareness confirming the truth of his observations. The mate bonds throughout the general population had grown stronger in response to Guardian Queen presence, creating stability in supernatural relationships that translated into increased fertility and genetic health across multiple generations. "What about the resistance factions?" she asked, though her supernatural senses had already detected the truth of their situation through her connection to the awakened bloodline network. "Lady Celeste has established the redemption territories in the Far Eastern regions," Thane replied with approval that had taken months to develop. "Former Alliance hardliners who chose exile over integration are learning to build communities without the artificial advantages they gained from suppressing others' abilities." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Celeste, who had once led assassination attempts against Guardian bloodlines, was now proving that even the most committed opponents of restoration could find purpose in building rather than destroying. Her exile had become voluntary service, creating safe spaces for those who needed time to adapt to supernatural balance they had been taught to fear. She sends regular reports through the awakened Guardian line of House Ravencrest, Lyra said, allowing herself a smile at the complexity of redemption that extended even to former enemies. The redemption territories are actually thriving. Turns out that people who had been enhanced through stolen supernatural abilities can develop legitimate power when they stop fighting against natural balance. Kieran emerged from the palace chambers with fluid grace that spoke of alpha authority, enhanced rather than diminished by months of partnership with Guardian Queen abilities. Through their mate bond, she felt his contentment at the day's council sessions, where problems that would have taken weeks to resolve under the old system were addressed in hours through supernatural efficiency. "The air is strong today," he said, placing his hands on her growing belly with reverence that made their unborn child respond with movements that glowed faintly through her skin. "I can sense abilities that will exceed both of ours combined." Through their enhanced connection, Lyra could perceive their child's supernatural potential with clarity that filled her with wonder and slight trepidation. This wouldn't be just a guardian or just an alpha, but something unprecedented, a being whose genetics combined the best aspects of both bloodlines in ways that previous generations could never have achieved. The prophecies speak of children born from fully bonded Guardian Alpha partnerships, Oracle Thane said with quiet intensity that made the evening air shimmer with anticipation. Beings whose abilities will reshape the supernatural world in ways we can barely imagine. "No pressure there," Lyra laughed, though her hand moved protectively over her belly as she spoke. "Just raising the child who might revolutionize supernatural society." "All children have that potential," Kieran replied, with wisdom that came from months of witnessing how individual choices could reshape entire political landscapes. "The only difference is that ours will have abilities that make their choices more consequential." As the sun set over their transformed kingdom, painting the sky in shades that matched the silver and gold of their combined supernatural heritage, Lyra reflected on the journey that had brought them from impossible circumstances to this moment of profound contentment. She had begun as a servant girl scrubbing floors, convinced that her worth was measured by how invisible she could make herself. The awakening of her guardian bloodline had revealed abilities she never could have imagined, but more than that, it had restored balance to a world that had been artificially broken for centuries. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, his enhanced perception reading the complex emotions flowing through their mate bond. "About how much has changed," she replied, leaning into his warmth while their unborn child responded to his presence with movements that carried their own supernatural energy. "About how the world told me I was nothing, and how discovering the truth about my heritage proved that sometimes the world is wrong about fundamental things." Through the mate bond, she felt his understanding of the deeper truth beneath her words. Guardian restoration hadn't just returned power to suppressed bloodlines. It had proven that artificial limitations could be overcome when people chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience. "The other awakened bloodlines are thriving," she continued, her awareness touching the Guardian families who had chosen to embrace their heritage across territories that had once considered such abilities threats to stability. 17 partnerships that have transformed governance, military defense, trade relationships, and most importantly, the hope that supernatural children can grow up in a world that celebrates rather than suppresses their abilities. "And the ones who chose not to awaken?" Kieran asked, though they both knew the answer through their shared connection to the broader supernatural community. "Safe, protected, living their chosen lives without pressure to become something they never wanted to be." The legal frameworks they had established ensured that Guardian heritage remained a choice rather than an obligation, preserving individual autonomy while making restoration available to those who desired it. As night settled over the kingdom, transforming the landscape into silver shadows touched with moonlight, Lyra felt their child stirring with supernatural awareness that seemed to respond to the celestial energy. This next generation would grow up in a world where abilities were celebrated rather than hidden, where partnerships were based on recognition rather than political convenience. "I love you," Kieran said quietly, the simple words carrying depths of meaning that their mate bond amplified into absolute truth that resonated through every cell of their enhanced forms. "I love you too," she replied, feeling their unborn child respond to the declaration with movements that glowed with inherited power. From the palace balcony, they could see the lights of settlements across territories that had been transformed by Guardian restoration, communities where supernatural abilities enhanced rather than threatened daily life. Trade routes that had been disrupted by artificial conflicts now flowed smoothly under Guardian-enhanced negotiations. Military outposts that had maintained expensive vigilance against manufactured threats could redirect resources toward actual development projects. Most importantly, they could sense the growing network of awakened bloodlines whose partnerships with alpha leaders were creating stability that reached into every aspect of supernatural society. The Great Suppression had ended not through conquest or political maneuvering, but through the simple recognition that some connections were stronger than fear. The air within her moved again, and through their enhanced awareness, both parents could perceive abilities that would make their own transformation seem like preparation for what was yet to come. This child would grow up in a world where Guardian Alpha partnerships were normal rather than revolutionary, where supernatural balance was expected rather than miraculous. But most importantly, they would grow up knowing that their worth was inherent rather than earned, that their abilities were gifts to be shared rather than weapons to be feared, and that true power came from partnership rather than domination. As the stars emerged in patterns that had guided Guardian Queens and Alpha Kings for millennia, Lyra and Kieran stood together on the balcony overlooking their transformed kingdom, content in the knowledge that some bonds transcended politics, some truths survived suppression, and some loves were strong enough to reshape the world. The Alpha King's war beast caught her scent 3 miles from the Thornwood Grove, and the primal roar that erupted from his throat shattered the morning stillness like thunder announcing an approaching storm. Kieran had been reviewing territorial disputes in his private study when the savage howl of his inner wolf demanded immediate action, driven by a mate bond that screamed of danger and blood and the metallic taste of silver weapons. He didn't remember mounting his stallion or commanding the royal guard to follow. One moment he was civilized ruler weighing political documents. The next he was racing through forest paths with supernatural speed while his beast clawed frantically at the cage of his human form. Something had threatened what belonged to him, and every instinct older than civilization demanded violent retribution against anyone who dared touch his mate. The grove came into view through the trees, and what he saw there made his vision blur red with murderous fury. Lyra stood in the centre of the ancient stone circle, silver light fading from her skin like the afterglow of lightning. 6 black-clad figures were scattered around the sacred space, 4 unconscious, 2 held immobile by root systems that responded only to the most ancient bloodlines. The scent of silver weapons and spilled blood hung heavy in the air, telling a story that made his war beast demand immediate and violent justice. They had tried to kill her. His mate. The one person in all the kingdoms whose safety mattered more than his own life. "Stand down," he commanded his guards as they prepared to follow him into the grove, his voice carrying the supernatural authority that brooked no argument. This was pack business now, and some things required the personal attention of an Alpha King whose mate had been threatened with assassination. Lyra turned as he approached, and the sight of her stopped him cold. Power radiated from her newly awakened form like heat from forged steel, transforming the servant girl he'd been forced to ignore into something magnificent and terrible. Her dark eyes held flecks of silver that hadn't been there before, and when she moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator discovering her true nature. "You're hurt," was the first thing he said, noticing the silver burns on her palms where she'd wielded enemy weapons. "I'm alive," she replied, and the strength in her voice sent electricity through the mate bond that connected them, which is more than they planned. Kieran studied the immobilized assassins with the cold calculation of someone who had ruled through times of war and political upheaval. Professional killers with expensive equipment and coordinated tactics didn't appear randomly in ancient groves. This had been planned, funded, and executed by someone with significant resources and intimate knowledge of palace routines. "Who sent you?" he asked the conscious female archer, allowing enough of his beast's presence to surface that his voice carried the promise of creative violence. She tried to meet his gaze with defiance, but supernatural authority was not something humans could resist indefinitely. "The Eastern Coalition," she gasped, her resistance crumbling under the weight of his alpha power. "They have records of the old bloodlines. They know what she is." Kieran's attention shifted to Lyra, whose silver-flecked eyes were watching him with new understanding. The mate bond between them had always been strong, but now it thrummed with added intensity that spoke of power awakening on both sides of their connection. "What bloodline?" he demanded. The archer's laugh was bitter and terrified in equal measure. "Guardian stock, ancient royal line that ruled alongside the first Alpha Kings before the Great Suppression. They bred her family into poverty and ignorance, but blood will tell, especially when it's threatened with extinction." The implications hit Kieran like physical blows. Guardian bloodlines had been legends for 3 centuries, royal supernatural families whose power complemented and strengthened Alpha authority rather than competing with it. If Lyra carried that heritage, it explained the impossible strength of their mate bond and the way his beast recognized her as equal rather than subordinate. It also explained why someone wanted her dead before she could complete whatever awakening process had begun. "How many others know?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would complicate everything about his current political situation. "Enough!" the male leader snarled, finding his voice despite the magical restraints. "Enough to ensure that every supernatural faction with territorial ambitions will be hunting her within the week. The Eastern Coalition was just the first to act." Kieran felt his war beast pushing against the boundaries of human form, demanding that he shift and tear apart everyone who posed a threat to his mate. The rational part of his mind knew that losing control would solve nothing, but rationality felt like a thin veneer over the primal need to protect what belonged to him. "They planned this," Lyra said quietly, her voice carrying new harmonics that made the grove's ancient magic resonate in response. "Someone wanted me here when the awakening began, someone who knew exactly what would happen when I was threatened." The truth of that statement settled over Kieran like ice water, cutting through his rage with cold clarity. The timing was too perfect, the location too significant, the assassins too conveniently informative about bloodlines and political implications. Someone had orchestrated this entire scenario, using deadly enemies as unwitting tools to trigger Lyra's transformation. "Oh, Oracle Thane," he realized aloud. "He's the only one with access to the old bloodline records and enough knowledge of ancient magic to predict awakening triggers." Lyra's expression shifted as pieces of a larger puzzle began clicking into place. "He sent me a message 3 days ago. Official seal, council authority. I thought it was legitimate." "It was legitimate," Kieran said grimly. "Just not from who you thought. Thane has been pushing for bloodline verification programs for months, claiming the kingdom needs to identify suppressed supernatural heritage before our enemies can exploit it. I assumed he was being paranoid." Turns out he was being practical, Lyra said, looking down at her hands where silver lines were still faintly visible across her palms. How many others are there? How many people carrying suppressed bloodlines that could be awakened the same way? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond personal safety. If the Eastern Coalition was actively hunting suppressed bloodlines, and if there were others like Lyra scattered throughout the kingdom, then they were looking at the opening moves of a much larger conflict. Kieran's warbeast growled approval as his mate demonstrated strategic thinking that matched her newly awakened power. She wasn't just surviving the crisis, she was already analysing broader tactical implications with the instincts of someone born to rule. "We need to get you back to the palace," he said, though every instinct rebelled against moving her anywhere until all threats were eliminated. "There will be others coming, and this grove won't provide protection against a coordinated assault." "What about them?" Lyra gestured toward the immobilized assassins. Kieran studied the captives with the cold assessment of someone who had made difficult decisions for the good of his kingdom. They were enemy agents who had attempted regicide against his mate, but they were also sources of intelligence about a broader conspiracy that threatened supernatural stability across multiple territories. "They're coming back with us," he decided, alive for questioning, but make no mistake, they'll face execution for attempted assassination of royal blood. The female archer's eyes widened at the casual mention of royal status, and Kieran realised his slip revealed more about Lyra's true position than he'd intended. But the mate bond between them made deception impossible, and pretending she was still just a servant would be laughable after witnessing her supernatural abilities. "Royal blood," the archer whispered. "Guardian bloodlines held royal status equal to Alpha Kings during the ancient period," Kieran explained, allowing his beast's satisfaction to colour his voice. "If she's genuine Guardian stock, she outranks half the current territorial leaders." Lyra was staring at him with an expression that mixed wonder and terror in equal measure. "I don't know how to be royal. I don't know anything about ancient bloodlines or political authority. Yesterday I was scrubbing floors." "Yesterday you hadn't awakened to your true nature," Kieran replied, moving closer until he could feel the warmth radiating from her enhanced form. "Today you're something the Eastern Coalition fears enough to commit assassination. That's not the profile of someone who scrubs floors." The mate bond flared between them as he reached out to examine the silver burns on her palms, his touch sending sparks of recognition through their enhanced connection. Her power called to his in ways that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with perfect complementarity. "This is going to complicate everything, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Kieran's laugh was rough with barely controlled emotion. "Lyra, my war beast has been trying to claim you as mate since the moment we met, despite every political reason that should make it impossible. Now I discover you carry ancient royal bloodline that makes you my equal in supernatural hierarchy. Complicated doesn't begin to cover what this is going to do to kingdom politics." "What about your arranged engagement?" The question hit the heart of their impossible situation. Lady Celeste and her powerful family expected confirmation of the political marriage within the month, and breaking that arrangement would destabilise alliances across 3 territories. But the mate bond between him and Lyra was beyond negotiation now, strengthened by her awakening into something that made separation physically painful. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in those words cost him more than any lie could have. "But I know that losing you would destroy me. Politics be damned." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation as his royal guard finally caught up, along with reinforcements he'd summoned through Mind Link during the ride to the grove. 20 armed riders surrounded the stone circle, ready to eliminate any remaining threats to their Alpha King and his newly revealed mate. "Secure the prisoners for transport," Kieran commanded, his voice carrying the supernatural authority that made immediate obedience automatic. "Full security protocols until they're safely contained in the palace dungeons." As his guards moved to carry out orders, Kieran turned back to Lyra with an expression that mixed determination and desperate hope. The mate bond between them was stronger now, enhanced by her awakening, but it also made their separation more impossible than ever. "Whatever happens with the political situation," he said quietly, "you need to know that my beast has chosen you, not just as mate, but as equal partner. That's not something that can be negotiated away, no matter what external pressures demand." Lyra's silver-flecked eyes held his gaze steadily. "What if choosing me destroys your kingdom? What if choosing politics destroys us both?" The question hung between them as the reality of their situation crystallized into unavoidable clarity. The mate bond was not a political convenience that could be managed around other obligations. It was a fundamental force that made half measures impossible and demanded acknowledgement regardless of consequences. The ride back to the palace would give them time to consider their options, but Kieran already knew the truth. His war beast had been roaring since the moment he scented danger around his mate. Some choices were bigger than politics, and some bonds were stronger than kingdoms. The Eastern Coalition had made a critical error in their assassination attempt. Instead of eliminating a threat, they had awakened something that would reshape the supernatural political landscape across all territories, and they had given his mate a very personal reason to ensure their plans failed completely. Oracle Thane arrived at the palace before the royal party returned from Thornwood Grove, his ancient form moving through the corridors with purpose that spoke of carefully orchestrated timing. When Lyra finally encountered him in the private council chamber, she understood immediately that nothing about their meeting was coincidental. He was waiting beside a table covered with artifacts that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Scrolls bound in leather so old it had turned black with age, crystals that hummed with frequencies she could feel in her bones, and a collection of silver jewellery that made her newly awakened power respond with recognition she couldn't explain. "Lady Lyra," he said, and the way he spoke her name carried weight that transformed it from servant's designation to something approaching reverence. Or perhaps I should say, Lady Lyra of House Shadowmere, last known survivor of the Guardian bloodlines that once ruled these lands alongside the Alpha Kings. The name hit her like a physical blow, connecting to something buried so deep in her genetic memory that it felt like remembering a dream from childhood. Shadowmere. The word tasted like moonlight and ancient power when she whispered it aloud, and somewhere in the depths of her mind ancestral voices stirred with approval. "That's impossible," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. The artifacts on the table were responding to her presence, their inner light growing stronger as she moved closer, and the largest crystal was actually singing in harmonies that made her teeth ache with supernatural resonance. "Nothing about your bloodline has ever been impossible," Oracle Thane replied, unrolling one of the ancient scrolls with hands that trembled slightly with age. "Difficult to access, deliberately suppressed, systematically hidden from view, yes, but never impossible." The scroll revealed a family tree written in silver ink that seemed to move and shimmer in the candlelight. Lyra traced the branching lines with her finger, following names and dates that stretched back over 3 centuries, and found her own name at the bottom of a lineage that included queens, warriors, and supernatural guardians whose power had once been legendary. House Shadowmere was the last of the Guardian families to maintain royal status. Thane continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting historical truth. "Your great-great-grandmother, Queen Morwen Shadowmere, ruled the Northern Territories in partnership with Alpha King Aldrich until the Great Suppression began." "What was the Great Suppression?" Thane's expression darkened as he moved to another section of the table where political documents told a story of systematic persecution that made Lyra's newly awakened power burn with inherited rage. "A coordinated campaign to eliminate Guardian bloodlines from positions of power," he explained. "Justified as necessary for political stability, executed through laws that stripped Guardian families of titles, lands, and legal protections. Within 2 generations, most guardian lines had been bred into poverty or driven into exile. The documents showed the methodical nature of the suppression, laws requiring guardian families to register their supernatural abilities, restrictions on guardian marriage to non-guardians, and finally, outright prohibition of guardian participation in territorial governance. What had begun as administrative regulation had evolved into systematic elimination of an entire supernatural class. "But why?" Lyra demanded. "If guardian power complemented alpha authority, why would anyone want to suppress it?" "Because complementary power can become competitive power under the right circumstances," Thane said grimly. "And because territorial leaders feared what might happen if guardians and alpha kings formed permanent alliances through mate bonds." He gestured to another scroll that detailed the supernatural abilities of fully awakened guardian bloodlines, and Lyra felt her breath catch as she read descriptions of power that seemed impossible even by supernatural standards. Enhanced physical abilities were just the beginning. Mature guardians could communicate telepathically across vast distances, manipulate elemental forces, and most significantly, amplify the supernatural abilities of their bonded mates to levels that made them nearly invincible in combat. A mated pair of Alpha King and Guardian Queen could rule absolutely, she realized aloud. No human or supernatural force could challenge their combined authority. "Precisely, which is why your family was specifically targeted for the most thorough suppression. Your bloodline carries the strongest guardian genetics, making you capable of bonding with Alpha Kings in ways that would create unprecedented supernatural partnerships." Thane moved to the jewellery collection, selecting a necklace of twisted silver that seemed to writhe like living metal in his hands. "Your grandmother managed to hide this before she was executed for refusing to submit to genetic suppression. It's been waiting for the rightful heir to claim it." The moment the silver touched Lyra's skin, power exploded through her system with intensity that made her previous awakening seem like a gentle warming by comparison. Memories that weren't her own flooded her consciousness, images of guardian queens commanding the forces of nature, of alpha kings whose authority extended across entire continents, of supernatural partnerships that had maintained peace and prosperity for centuries before fear and politics destroyed them. She saw her grandmother's face clearly for the first time, a woman whose silver eyes had blazed with power and defiance even as enemies stripped away everything she'd built. She felt her great-grandmother's fury at the systematic destruction of guardian culture, and deeper still, she touched the ancient memories of the first guardian alpha partnerships that had founded the current territorial system. The suppression wasn't just about political control, she gasped as the memory download subsided. It was about breaking something fundamental in the supernatural world's balance. The guardian bloodlines were created to work in partnership with alpha authority, Thane confirmed. Without that balance, alpha kings have been ruling through force rather than natural supernatural harmony. It's why territorial disputes have become more frequent, why mate bonds have grown weaker across the general population, why the birth rates of supernatural children have declined over the past century. Lyra stared at the artifacts surrounding her, understanding finally dawning about the true scope of what had been stolen from the world. The suppression hadn't just eliminated her family's power, it had damaged the fundamental structure of supernatural society in ways that were still causing problems generations later. "You orchestrated the assassination attempt," she said quietly. "You knew what would happen when my life was threatened." Thane's smile held no apology. "Guardian bloodlines awaken through crisis that demand survival power. I could have spent years trying to coax your abilities to surface through meditation and ritual, or I could create a situation where awakening was the only alternative to death." "You could have gotten me killed." "I could have," he agreed, "but guardian genetics don't work that way. Your power wouldn't have remained dormant if death was truly imminent. The awakening was inevitable once the right pressure was applied." Lyra felt anger surge through her newly enhanced system, and the crystals on the table responded by flaring with light that made shadows dance wildly across the chamber walls. "You used me. You put me in mortal danger to serve your political agenda." "I restored you to your birthright," Thane corrected firmly. "I gave you the chance to become what you were always meant to be, instead of letting you waste away as a servant while your bloodline died with you." The truth of that statement warred with her fury at being manipulated, creating internal conflict that made her power fluctuate wildly between control and chaos. Part of her wanted to strike out at the old man who had orchestrated her trauma, but another part recognized that without his intervention, she would have lived and died without ever knowing what she truly was. "How many others are there?" she asked finally. "How many people carrying suppressed guardian bloodlines?" Thane moved to another section of documents that revealed the scope of his research into surviving guardian genetics. 17 confirmed cases across the Northern Territories based on genealogical analysis and supernatural sensitivity testing, possibly 30 or 40 more with diluted bloodlines that might awaken under the right circumstances. The numbers hit Lyra like physical blows. 50 or 60 people living as servants, farmers and craftsmen while carrying the genetic heritage of supernatural royalty. Entire guardian lines reduced to ignorance and poverty, while the world suffered from the loss of their balancing influence on Alpha authority. The Eastern Coalition knows about them, she realised. That's why they moved against me so quickly. They're not just trying to prevent my awakening. They're trying to eliminate all guardian bloodlines before they can be restored. "Which is why your awakening has to succeed completely," Thane said with quiet intensity. "You're not just reclaiming your own heritage, you're the key to restoring supernatural balance across all the territories." Lyra picked up another piece of jewellery from the collection, a bracelet covered in runes that seemed to shift and change as she watched. The moment it touched her wrist, knowledge flooded her mind about guardian abilities she hadn't even known existed. Elemental manipulation, telepathic communication, supernatural healing, and most importantly, the power to awaken other suppressed bloodlines through direct contact. "I can wake the others," she breathed, understanding the full implications of her role in Thane's larger plan. "Once I complete my own awakening, I can trigger theirs safely." A guardian queen with access to her full abilities can awaken an entire bloodline network, Thane confirmed. Imagine 50 guardian alpha partnerships working in coordination to restore supernatural balance. Imagine territorial disputes resolved through natural authority rather than constant warfare. Imagine the birth of a new generation of supernatural children whose power isn't diminished by genetic suppression. The vision he painted was intoxicating, a world where her people reclaimed their rightful place, where the supernatural community achieved the harmony that had been destroyed by fear and politics. But it also meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond her personal safety. "What about the Alpha King?" she asked quietly. "What happens to the mate bond if I become something that powerful?" Thane's smile was knowing and slightly predatory. Guardian Queen power doesn't compete with Alpha authority, it amplifies it. A mated pair of your combined bloodlines would create a supernatural partnership unlike anything seen since the ancient period. You wouldn't be taking power from him. You would be making him stronger than any Alpha King in recorded history. The mate bond pulsed between them, as if responding to the promise of enhanced connection, and Lyra felt her body respond with anticipation that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with the primal recognition between perfectly matched supernatural partners. But first, she had to survive long enough to complete the awakening process. And she had to decide whether the restoration of guardian power was worth the war it would certainly trigger with every faction that benefited from the current suppressed balance. The hidden training chambers beneath the palace had been sealed for 3 centuries, their existence known only to Oracle Thane and the ancient bloodlines that had once used them to hone supernatural abilities beyond human comprehension. When Lyra descended the stone steps for the first time, power that had been dormant since the Great Suppression stirred to life in response to her guardian heritage. The circular chamber was carved from living rock, its walls inscribed with runes that glowed silver in response to her presence. Training equipment forged from metals that hummed with their own supernatural frequencies lined the space. Weapons designed for beings whose strength could shatter ordinary steel. Practiced targets that moved and responded to enhanced reflexes beyond human limitation, and most intriguingly, a series of mirrors that reflected not just physical form, but the supernatural essence beneath. "Your ancestors trained here," Oracle Thane explained, as Lyra moved through the space with growing recognition that felt like coming home. Guardian queens whose power could level mountains if left uncontrolled, learning precision and restraint alongside devastating effectiveness. Lyra approached one of the mirrors and gasped as her reflection showed not the servant girl she'd been mere days ago, but something magnificent and terrifying. Silver light outlined her form like internal fire. Her eyes blazed with power that made the air shimmer, and behind her human shape, the shadow of something far more primal moved with predatory grace. "What am I seeing?" "Your true form," came a familiar voice from the chamber entrance, and Lyra turned to find Kieran descending the steps with fluid motion that spoke of supernatural grace barely held in check. The guardian essence that's been awakening since Thornwood Grove. He moved differently in this space, she realised. The careful restraint he maintained in public settings was unnecessary here, allowing his alpha presence to manifest with intensity that made her newly awakened power respond with eager recognition. When he reached the chamber floor, the ancient runes flared brighter, acknowledging the presence of royal bloodlines that belonged in this sacred space. "You're going to train with me?" she asked, though the mate bond was already singing with anticipation that had nothing to do with combat skills and everything to do with the excuse to be alone together without political oversight. "Guardian powers work best in partnership with alpha abilities," Kieran replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made her skin prickle with awareness. "If you're going to master what you're becoming, you need a training partner who can match your enhanced capabilities." Oracle Thane withdrew to the upper levels with a knowing smile, leaving them alone in a space designed for supernatural beings to explore the full extent of their abilities without restraint or consequence. "Show me what you can do," Kieran said, moving to the centre of the chamber with predatory fluidity that made Lyra's pulse race. She closed her eyes and reached for the power that had been growing stronger since her awakening, feeling it respond like liquid fire in her veins. When she opened them again, silver light was pouring from her skin, and her enhanced senses could perceive layers of reality that normal vision couldn't access. The chamber's runic inscriptions revealed themselves as a complex magical framework designed to contain and amplify supernatural energies. Kieran's own power blazed around him like golden fire, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. "Impressive," he said, though his tone suggested he was holding back judgment. "But raw power without control is just destruction waiting to happen. Attack me." "What?" "Use your guardian abilities to attack me," he repeated, settling into a combat stance that transformed him from civilized ruler to apex predator in the space between heartbeats. "Hold nothing back! I can handle whatever you can generate." Lyra hesitated for a moment, then launched herself forward with speed that blurred the edges of movement. Her enhanced reflexes guided her strikes with precision that felt instinctive, targeting pressure points and vulnerable areas with knowledge she didn't remember learning. But Kieran met her attack with fluid grace, deflecting her blows and countering with movements so fast they seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. The first exchange lasted 30 seconds and ended with both of them breathing hard, circling each other with new respect for their opponent's capabilities. "Again," Kieran commanded. "Faster this time. Let your guardian instincts guide the combat flow." This time, Lyra didn't hold back. Power flooded her system as she accessed abilities that felt both foreign and familiar, allowing supernatural speed and strength to guide her movements, while enhanced tactical awareness mapped every potential advantage in the chamber. She struck from impossible angles, used the chamber's architecture to launch aerial attacks, and discovered she could manipulate the training equipment telepathically to create additional threats. Kieran matched her escalation with his own supernatural abilities, his alpha power manifesting as enhanced speed, preternatural combat awareness, and strength that could stop her most devastating strikes with casual effort. But more than that, he seemed to anticipate her attacks with accuracy that spoke of deeper connection than mere training partnership. The mate bond, she realized as they broke apart after a particularly intense exchange. You can sense my intentions before I act on them. And you're unconsciously adapting your fighting style to complement mine, he replied, golden eyes blazing with satisfaction. Guardian Alpha partnerships create tactical synergy that makes both fighters more effective than they would be separately. They moved together through a series of increasingly complex combat scenarios, their supernatural abilities weaving together in patterns that felt like dance choreographed by instincts older than civilization. When Lyra's power flared beyond her control, Kieran's presence provided grounding that kept her centered. When his alpha dominance threatened to overwhelm the training space, her guardian energy offered balance that transformed raw authority into focused precision. This is what they were afraid of, Lyra said during a brief rest, her body still humming with post-combat energy. This is why they had to suppress the guardian bloodlines. Kieran nodded grimly, moving to examine one of the ancient weapons while his breathing returned to normal. A mated pair fighting in perfect coordination, with each partner's abilities enhancing the other's effectiveness, we would be nearly impossible to defeat in combat. Nearly? Numbers could still overwhelm us. Enough ordinary fighters with the right tactics and equipment could eventually wear down even Guardian Alpha partnerships, but it would require significant resources and careful planning. Lyra approached him as he tested the balance of a sword forged from metal that sang with its own supernatural frequency. This close, she could feel the heat radiating from his enhanced form, could smell the mixture of exertion and alpha musk that made her newly awakened instincts respond with interest that had nothing to do with combat training. "Is this what it was like?" she asked quietly. "During the ancient period when guardian queens ruled alongside alpha kings?" According to the historical records, the partnerships were... He paused, seeming to search for words that could describe supernatural bonds beyond normal experience. Intimate in ways that transcended mere political alliance. The mate bonds were so strong that separation was physically painful, and the power sharing so complete that each partner could access the other's abilities during times of extreme need. The implications of that statement sent electricity through the mate bond connecting them, and Lyra felt her body respond with anticipation that made her skin flush with heat. "Show me," she said, moving closer until they were sharing breath in the space between words. Kieran's eyes blazed with golden fire as he reached out to touch her face with hands that trembled slightly despite their supernatural steadiness. "Lyra, if we explore that level of connection, there's no going back. The mate bond will become permanent, unbreakable. Your awakening will complete itself, and mine will evolve to match yours." "What about your political obligations? What about them?" His voice carried the conviction of someone who had moved beyond caring about consequences. "My war beast chose you before I even knew what you were. Now that I understand your true heritage, the idea of bonding with anyone else is not just politically inconvenient, it's biologically impossible." Lyra felt the truth of that statement resonating through their enhanced connection, confirming what her own instincts had been trying to tell her since the awakening began. The mate bond between them wasn't a romantic convenience that could be managed around other relationships. It was a fundamental force that demanded acknowledgement regardless of political cost. "Then show me," she repeated, and the challenge in her voice made his alpha nature respond with interest that blazed through their shared awareness. What happened next transcended anything she had experienced during the combat training. Kieran's hands on her skin created connection that went beyond physical touch, opening pathways between their supernatural essences that allowed power to flow freely between their enhanced forms. She could feel his alpha authority strengthening her guardian abilities, while her power amplified his natural dominance in ways that made the chamber's ancient runes flare with recognition. The sensation was overwhelming and perfect in equal measure, like finding the missing half of something she hadn't even realized was incomplete. Through their enhanced connection, she could access centuries of Alpha King knowledge about leadership, tactical planning, and supernatural authority. In return, her guardian heritage offered him understanding of elemental manipulation, telepathic communication, and power amplification that no Alpha had possessed since the Great Suppression. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and glowing with combined power that made the training chamber sing with harmonic frequencies. That, Kieran said with satisfaction that carried undertones of possessive claiming, is what the Eastern Coalition is afraid of. That is what they're trying to prevent with their assassination attempts and political manoeuvring. Lyra stared at her hands, which were now outlined with silver fire that seemed permanent rather than temporary manifestation. I can feel your thoughts, she realized aloud. Not just emotions through the mate bond, but actual tactical awareness and strategic planning. And I can sense your connection to the other suppressed bloodlines, Kieran replied, his expression shifting to something approaching awe. There are more of them than Oracle Thane estimated, dozens scattered across territories that have no idea what they're carrying in their genetic heritage. The implications of their enhanced partnership settled over them like destiny finally clicking into place. They weren't just mates anymore. They were supernatural partners whose combined abilities could reshape the political landscape of every territory that had participated in the Great Suppression. But first, they had to survive the war that their bonding would inevitably trigger. The delegation from the Eastern Alliance arrived 3 days after Lyra's training had reached its most intensive phase, their banners snapping in the morning wind like declarations of war barely contained by diplomatic protocol. From the palace balcony where she stood with Kieran, she could see the elaborate procession winding up the mountain road, 50 armed riders in ceremonial armour, supply wagons loaded with gifts and weapons in equal measure, and at the centre of it all, the unmistakable figure of Lord Commander Valdris, whose reputation for political ruthlessness was matched only by his skill at turning negotiations into ultimatums. "They know," Kieran said quietly, his alpha senses reading the delegation's approach with supernatural accuracy. "Someone's told them about your awakening." Lyra felt the mate bond pulse between them as his tension translated into her own heightened awareness. Through their enhanced connection, she could sense the careful control he was maintaining over his war beast, which wanted to meet potential threats with immediate violence rather than diplomatic courtesy. "How much do they know?" "Enough to bring an army disguised as honour guard," Kieran replied grimly. "Valdris doesn't travel with 50 soldiers unless he's prepared for his negotiations to end in bloodshed." The reality of their situation crystallized with devastating clarity as the delegation reached the palace courtyard. Everything they had discovered about her heritage, everything they had built between them through training and enhanced bonding, everything that had seemed like destiny finally aligning in their favour, all of it was about to be measured against political realities that had no patience for personal happiness. Within an hour, the Great Hall was filled with territorial representatives who had travelled from across the known lands to witness what everyone understood would be a pivotal moment in supernatural politics. Lord Commander Valdris stood at the centre of the assembled dignitaries, his presence commanding attention through sheer force of personality, backed by decades of successful military campaigns. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice carrying easily across the vast chamber, "the Eastern Alliance comes bearing gifts in celebration of your impending nuptials to Lady Celeste of House Ravencrest, as agreed in the territorial accords signed at summer solstice." The formal language couldn't disguise the underlying threat, and Lyra felt every supernatural being in the hall respond to the tension that crackled like lightning between opposing storm fronts. Lady Celeste herself stood among the delegation, her beauty and poise showcasing exactly why she had been chosen for political alliance: elegant, accomplished, and carrying bloodlines that would strengthen territorial bonds across 3 major regions. The alliance has also prepared wedding gifts appropriate to the significance of this union, Valdris continued, gesturing towards servants who carried forward a collection of items that made Lyra's enhanced senses recoil with instinctive revulsion: silver chains, suppression collars, genetic binding artifacts designed to prevent supernatural awakening. The message was unmistakably clear: marry according to political arrangement, or face the systematic elimination of guardian bloodlines across every territory the Alliance controlled. Thoughtful gifts, Kieran said, with diplomatic neutrality that didn't quite hide the lethal undertones his alpha nature brought to formal courtesy, though perhaps premature given that certain recent developments have complicated the timeline for such celebrations. What developments could possibly complicate an arrangement that has been in negotiation for over 2 years? Lady Celeste asked, her voice carrying just enough innocent curiosity to make the question sound reasonable rather than challenging. Lyra felt the weight of every gaze in the hall settle on her as the moment of truth arrived. She could remain silent, hidden among the servants and attendants, and allow political necessity to override personal truth. Or she could step forward and claim her rightful place, knowing that doing so would trigger the very conflict everyone was trying to avoid. The mate bond pulsed with Kieran's unspoken support, but she could also feel his anguish at being forced to choose between her safety and kingdom stability. Through their enhanced connection, she sensed the calculations running through his tactical awareness, the mathematical certainty that open conflict with the Alliance would cost thousands of lives, regardless of who ultimately won. "The development," she said clearly, stepping out from behind the pillar where she had been observing, "is that you're trying to force an Alpha King to mate with someone other than his true partner." The hall erupted into chaos as her words triggered immediate recognition from every supernatural being present. Her guardian heritage blazed around her like silver fire, impossible to deny or dismiss, while the mate bond connecting her to Kieran flared with intensity that made several of the more sensitive attendees step back in obvious discomfort. "Impossible," Lady Celeste breathed, but her expression revealed she was already recognizing the truth of what her senses were reporting. Guardian bloodlines were eliminated centuries ago. "Suppressed," Lyra corrected firmly, "hidden and bred into poverty to prevent exactly this kind of political complication. But blood will tell, especially when it's threatened with extinction." Lord Commander Valdris recovered from his initial shock with the speed of someone accustomed to tactical situations spiralling beyond initial parameters. "Even if the girl carries guardian heritage," he said with calculated dismissal, "she remains a servant with no political value. The territorial accords cannot be dissolved for romantic sentiment." "The territorial accords," Kieran said with quiet authority that made the hall fall silent, "were negotiated under the assumption that no guardian bloodlines survived to complicate alpha mating protocols. That assumption was incorrect." "You would risk war over a servant girl?" The question hung in the air like a blade balanced on its edge, carrying implications that extended far beyond personal choice. Lyra could feel the political calculations happening around the hall as territorial representatives measured the cost of conflict against the potential benefits of either supporting or opposing guardian restoration. "I would honour the mate bond that my war beast recognises as fundamental truth," Kieran replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made every supernatural being present acknowledge the power behind his words. "Guardian Alpha partnerships take precedence over political convenience." "Precedence according to what authority?" Valdris demanded. "Ancient customs that were abandoned for good reason? Bloodline privileges that were eliminated to prevent exactly this kind of destabilization? precedence according to this. Kieran moved to stand beside Lyra, and the moment their enhanced forms touched, power erupted between them with intensity that made the air shimmer and the great hall's ancient stones sing in harmonic response. Their combined abilities created a supernatural presence that dwarfed anything else in the chamber, demonstrating exactly why Guardian Alpha partnerships had once ruled unchallenged. The display lasted only seconds, but its impact was unmistakable. Several of the territorial representatives were already reconsidering their positions as they witnessed power that could reshape regional politics with casual effort. That, Kieran said quietly, is the authority that establishes mate-bond precedence over political arrangement. Lady Celeste stepped forward with dignity that managed to preserve her pride despite the devastating public rejection. And if I refuse to dissolve our engagement, if the Alliance decides to enforce the territorial accords through military action, then you will face war with a Guardian Alpha partnership that has spent the last week learning to fight in perfect coordination, Lyra replied, allowing enough of her awakened power to surface that everyone present could sense the truth of that threat. The girl may carry Guardian bloodlines, Valdris said with cold calculation, but she remains untrained and newly awakened. The Alliance commands resources that could overwhelm even enhanced supernatural abilities through sheer numbers and superior tactics. You're welcome to test that assumption, Kieran said, with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a military engagement. But before you commit to that course of action, you should understand exactly what you would be fighting. The challenge in his voice triggered responses throughout the hall as supernatural instincts recognized Alpha authority backed by Guardian power. Several of the Alliance representatives were already showing signs of uncertainty as they measured their political objectives against the reality of facing opponents whose combined abilities exceeded anything in recorded history. The Eastern Alliance requires time to consider this development, Valdris announced with diplomatic formality that barely concealed tactical retreat. We propose a recess of 7 days to allow proper consultation with our territorial councils. 7 days, Kieran agreed, though his tone suggested he understood exactly what the Alliance would be doing with that time. After which we expect formal recognition of the mate bond and dissolution of all competing arrangements. And if the Alliance determines that Guardian restoration poses an unacceptable threat to territorial stability. Lyra felt the mate bond flare as Kieran's war beast responded to the implied threat with predatory satisfaction. Then you will discover why the Great Suppression required coordinated effort from every major power to succeed, and why this time there are no political alliances strong enough to repeat that success. The delegation withdrew with elaborate courtesy that failed to disguise the emergency council meetings that would dominate the next week. As the Great Hall cleared, Lyra found herself alone with Kieran and the weight of consequences that neither of them could avoid. They'll use the time to coordinate attacks on other Guardian bloodlines, she said quietly. If they can't suppress me directly, they'll try to prevent any others from awakening to support us. Then we use the same time to find and protect as many as possible, Kieran replied, his tactical mind already working through defensive strategies. 7 days to locate suppressed bloodlines and offer them choices about awakening before our enemies make those choices for them. And after that? Kieran's smile held no humour, but it carried the savage satisfaction of someone who had finally stopped trying to balance impossible obligations. After that, we find out whether the world is ready for the return of Guardian Alpha rule, or whether we have to remind everyone why our ancestors were never successfully challenged. The mate bond pulsed between them with shared determination as they acknowledged the path they had chosen. There would be no more hiding, no more political compromise, no more pretending that their connection could be managed around other people's convenience. The war for Guardian restoration had begun, and they would meet it together. The pre-dawn mist clung to the palace walls like ghostly fingers as Lyra slipped through corridors she had once cleaned as a servant, her enhanced senses guiding her past sleeping guards with supernatural stealth that felt both natural and heartbreaking. every step away from Kieran sent agony through the mate bond that connected them, a physical pain that made her stumble and press her hand against the stone wall for support. She couldn't do this to him, couldn't force him to choose between her and the kingdom he had sworn to protect. The 7-day ultimatum from the Eastern Alliance had made the mathematics of their situation brutally clear. Honouring their mate bond would trigger a war that could destroy thousands of innocent lives, while her voluntary exile would preserve the peace that his political marriage to Lady Celeste could secure. The small pack on her back contained everything she owned that mattered: the silver jewellery that connected her to her guardian heritage, a handful of coins saved from her servant wages, and a letter she had written but couldn't bring herself to leave behind, explaining why she had to disappear before the Alliance deadline forced impossible choices. But as she reached the palace's outer courtyard, the mate bond suddenly blazed with such intensity that she cried out and fell to her knees on the cobblestones. Through their enhanced connection, she felt Kieran's immediate awareness of her departure, followed by emotional anguish so profound that it made her own pain seem insignificant by comparison. He was awake, and he was coming. Lyra forced herself to stand and stumbled toward the forest path that would take her beyond the territorial boundaries, knowing that every second of delay made it harder to maintain the resolve that had driven her from her bed. The rational part of her mind insisted that sacrifice was noble, that protecting him from an impossible choice was the ultimate expression of love. But her guardian heritage rebelled against the logic of surrender, and her newly awakened power responded to emotional distress by flaring with silver light that illuminated the morning mist, like captured starfire. She made it less than a mile before the sound of hoofbeats announced pursuit that moved with supernatural speed through the forest terrain. When Kieran's stallion burst through the tree line ahead of her, she realized he had used their enhanced connection to anticipate her route and intercept her flight. "No," he said, dismounting with fluid grace while his golden eyes blazed with authority that made her guardian instincts respond with automatic submission. "You don't get to make this decision for both of us." "Kieran, please," she said, backing away from him, though every cell in her body demanded she close the distance between them. "The Alliance will destroy everything you've built if you choose me over political stability. I can't be responsible for that kind of devastation." "And I can't be responsible for losing my mate to misguided nobility," he replied, moving closer despite her retreat. "Do you have any idea what your departure is doing to me? What it feels like to have the mate bond stretched beyond its limits?" Through their connection, she could feel exactly what it was doing to him. Physical agony that made breathing difficult, emotional devastation that threatened the careful control he maintained over his war beast, and desperate fury at being forced to choose between duty and survival. "The kingdom needs you functional," she whispered, though tears were streaming down her face as she spoke. "It needs you able to rule without the distraction of an impossible mate bond." "The kingdom needs me mated to someone who makes me stronger, not weaker," Kieran corrected with quiet intensity. "It needs the supernatural balance that Guardian Alpha partnerships were designed to provide." Before she could respond, the forest around them erupted with the sounds of multiple pursuit parties crashing through the underbrush. But these weren't palace guards following their Alpha King's emergency departure. These were coordinated hunting teams moving with the practiced efficiency of those tracking dangerous prey. "Eastern Alliance scouts!" Kieran snarled, his enhanced hearing identifying the approaching threats with supernatural accuracy. "They've been watching the palace, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity." Lyra's guardian senses confirmed what his Alpha awareness had detected. At least 20 trained fighters approaching from 3 different directions, their weapons carrying the distinctive silver signatures designed to kill supernatural beings. The Alliance had used the 7-day ultimatum as cover to position assassination teams, and her flight from the palace had provided the perfect isolated target. "They planned this," she realized with growing horror. The ultimatum, the political pressure, everything designed to force me into exactly this kind of vulnerable position. And they underestimated how far I would go to protect what belongs to me, Kieran replied, allowing his war beast to surface enough that golden fire blazed around his form like supernatural armor. The first wave of attackers emerged from the tree line with crossbows already aimed, their coordination speaking of extensive planning and professional execution. But they had prepared to face a newly awakened guardian, separated from her bonded alpha, not a mated pair fighting in perfect synchronization with months of training behind their partnership. Lyra felt her power flare in response to immediate danger, silver light erupting from her enhanced form, as guardian abilities she was still learning responded to life or death necessity. Through their mate bond, Kieran's tactical awareness flowed into her consciousness, while her supernatural senses provided him with combat information no alpha had possessed since the Great Suppression. They moved as one entity with two bodies, their enhanced abilities creating tactical advantages that turned overwhelming numbers into manageable chaos. Lyra's speed allowed her to close distances before enemies could react, while Kieran's strength could disable multiple opponents with single strikes. More importantly, their combined awareness meant no attack could catch them off guard, and no defensive position could be maintained against their coordinated assault. The first 10 attackers fell within minutes, their silver weapons proving ineffective against supernatural beings who fought with prehistoric cooperation, backed by royal bloodline power. "Impossible!" gasped one of the surviving scouts as he watched his carefully planned ambush dissolve into tactical disaster. Guardian abilities were supposed to be dormant. Newly awakened powers shouldn't be able to coordinate with Alpha authority at this level. "Tell your commanders," Kieran said, with deadly quietness as he disarmed the man with casual efficiency, that they fundamentally misunderstood what they were trying to eliminate. But even as they dealt with immediate threats, Lyra could sense additional pursuit parties converging on their location. The Alliance had committed significant resources to this assassination attempt, suggesting they viewed her elimination as critical to preventing Guardian restoration across all territories. "There are more coming," she said, her enhanced hearing tracking movement patterns that spoke of coordinated military operation rather than opportunistic attack. "Then we don't stay here to meet them," Kieran replied, moving toward his stallion with tactical awareness that was already planning their next moves. "We find defensible ground and force them to come at us on our terms." As they mounted his horse and began racing through forest paths that would take them toward more favorable terrain, Lyra felt the mate bond settling into permanent configuration that made separation not just painful, but literally impossible. Her flight from the palace had accomplished nothing except proving that their connection transcended individual choice. "I'm sorry," she said, clinging to him as supernatural speed carried them through wilderness that blurred past in streams of green and brown. "I thought I could spare you the impossible choice by removing myself from the equation." "The only impossible choice would be losing you to Alliance assassins while I was safely negotiating political compromises," Kieran replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the chaos surrounding them. "Whatever consequences come from honouring our mate bond, we face them together." Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued to grow as more Alliance forces joined the hunt. What had begun as a private moment of personal crisis was evolving into the opening engagement of a war that would determine whether Guardian bloodlines returned to their rightful place or were eliminated permanently from supernatural society. But as they raced toward uncertain safety, Lyra felt her power continuing to grow in response to sustained danger. The Alliance had made a critical error in their timing. Instead of catching a newly awakened Guardian at her most vulnerable, they had forced her to access abilities that might have taken months to develop under peaceful conditions. And they had given Kieran personal reasons to unleash the full extent of Alpha authority that political restraint normally kept carefully controlled. The hunt was far from over, but the hunters were about to discover that their prey had become something far more dangerous than their intelligence had suggested. The sacred grove of Moonhaven had been ancient when the first guardian queens learned to shift beneath its silver-barked trees, its power woven so deeply into the fabric of supernatural reality that even the Great Suppression hadn't been able to touch its fundamental magic. When Lyra and Kieran's desperate flight brought them to its borders 3 hours past dawn, she felt the ancestral recognition pulse through her awakened bloodline like a key finding its destined lock. "This place knows me," she whispered, dismounting from Kieran's stallion with movements that felt guided by genetic memory older than recorded history. "My grandmother stood here, my great-grandmother before her. They all came here when the awakening reached its final stages." The grove responded to her presence with visible manifestations of ancient power. Silver light began emanating from the trees themselves. The ground beneath her feet hummed with harmonic frequencies that made her bones vibrate, and the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural energy that had been waiting centuries for a worthy heir to claim it. "It's a trap," Kieran said grimly, his alpha senses reading the approaching pursuit with tactical precision that counted at least 40 Alliance soldiers moving through the surrounding forest. They herded us here deliberately. This was always their intended destination. But even as he spoke, Lyra could feel the grove's ancient protections stirring in response to royal guardian blood. Magical barriers that had been dormant since the last guardian queen's death were flickering to life, and the silver-barked trees were beginning to move with subtle shifts that would provide strategic advantages to anyone the grove recognized as belonging. "Let them come," she said, power flooding her system as the sacred space amplified her abilities beyond anything she had experienced during training. "This is where my bloodline was meant to make its stand." The first wave of Alliance soldiers emerged from the tree line with the coordinated precision of a military operation that had been planned down to the smallest detail. But their leader wasn't the professional commander Lyra had expected. It was Lady Celeste herself, dressed in battle leathers that revealed a warrior's training hidden beneath diplomatic elegance. "Surrender now!" Celeste called across the grove, her voice carrying authority backed by 50 armed fighters. "And your deaths will be quick. Force us to take you through combat, and I promise you'll suffer for every life your resistance costs." "Interesting change in negotiating tactics," Kieran replied, allowing his war beast to surface enough that golden fire blazed around his form. "Though I have to admit, I prefer honest threats to diplomatic pretense." "The diplomatic phase ended when you chose a servant girl over territorial stability," Celeste said with bitter fury that revealed how deeply his public rejection had wounded her pride. "The Alliance tried to give you a graceful way to fulfill your obligations. Since you rejected reason, you'll face the consequences of defiance." Lyra felt the grove's ancient magic responding to the threat against her with protective instincts that had been bred into the sacred space over millennia. The silver-bark trees began to shift position, creating natural barriers that would funnel attackers into kill zones while providing cover for defenders who belonged in this place. "Before we begin killing each other," she said, stepping forward with power blazing around her like captured starlight, "you should understand exactly what you're trying to eliminate." "A guardian bloodline that should have been ended centuries ago," Celeste replied dismissively. "Ancient power that has no place in the modern political structure." This ancient power. Lyra reached for the deepest levels of her awakened abilities, drawing on genetic memories that connected her to every guardian queen who had ever stood in this sacred space. Power erupted from her enhanced form with intensity that made the grove's silver trees sing in harmonic response, while the ancient protections woven into the ground flared to life with recognition that blazed like supernatural sunrise. The display lasted only seconds, but its impact was unmistakable. Several Alliance soldiers stepped back involuntarily as their human instincts recognized predatory authority that transcended anything they had been prepared to face. Even Celeste's confidence wavered as she witnessed power that made her political objections seem insignificant by comparison. "Impressive," she admitted with grudging respect, "but raw ability without training is just destruction waiting to be channeled. You've had weeks to develop whatever power you're carrying. We've had months to plan how to contain it." The Alliance forces began their assault with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who had studied Guardian abilities and prepared specific countermeasures. Silver nets designed to disrupt supernatural energy, crossbow bolts tipped with suppression crystals, and most concerning, several fighters who moved with enhanced speed that spoke of artificial ability enhancement through alchemical means. But they had prepared to face a newly awakened Guardian fighting alone, not a fully bonded mated pair whose abilities had been amplified by ancient sacred ground that recognized their bloodlines as rightful inheritors. Kieran's tactical awareness flowed through their mate bond, while Lyra's supernatural senses provided combat information no Alpha had possessed since the Great Suppression. They fought as a single entity with perfect coordination, their enhanced abilities creating tactical advantages that turned overwhelming numbers into manageable chaos. The grove itself joined the battle, ancient roots erupting from the ground to entangle attackers while silver-bark trees moved to provide strategic cover. Magical barriers deflected the most dangerous weapons while amplifying the effectiveness of Guardian and Alpha abilities beyond anything the Alliance had calculated in their planning. "Impossible!" gasped one of the surviving soldiers as he watched his coordinated assault dissolve into tactical disaster. "The intelligence reports said the grove's protections were dormant. Ancient magic wasn't supposed to respond to bloodlines that have been suppressed for centuries." "Your intelligence was incomplete," Lyra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that made the grove's power resonate in response. "Guardian bloodlines don't lose their connection to sacred spaces. They just wait for the right circumstances to reclaim what was always theirs." But as they fought, she could sense something wrong in the patterns of Alliance movement. Too many soldiers were falling back rather than pressing their attack, and Celeste was positioning herself with tactical awareness that suggested the assault had secondary objectives beyond simple elimination. "They're stalling," she realized with growing alarm. "This isn't their main plan, it's a distraction." Through their enhanced connection, Kieran's tactical mind reached the same conclusion with horrifying implications. "They're buying time for something else, another team, another target." "The other Guardian bloodlines," Lyra breathed, understanding flooding through her with devastating clarity. "While we're trapped here fighting for our lives, they're moving against every suppressed bloodline we haven't found yet." The grove's ancient magic pulsed with sympathetic recognition as her awareness expanded beyond the immediate battle to sense the broader supernatural landscape. Through her awakened abilities, she could feel distant echoes of Guardian heritage scattered across multiple territories. 17 confirmed bloodlines that Oracle Thane had identified, plus dozens more whose genetics carried enough potential to be dangerous if properly awakened. And she could feel the Alliance strike teams moving against them with coordinated precision that spoke of months of planning. "They used us," Kieran snarled, his war beast responding to the tactical manipulation with fury that made the air around him shimmer with barely controlled violence. "Everything, the ultimatum, the political pressure, even this ambush, all designed to keep us occupied while they eliminate potential allies before we can reach them." "Clever strategy," Celeste admitted with satisfaction that confirmed their worst fears. "You can't restore Guardian power if there are no Guardian bloodlines left to restore. By the time you finish dealing with us, every suppressed family line we've identified will be permanently eliminated." Lyra felt the mate bond flare with shared determination as she and Kieran acknowledged the scope of what they were facing. This wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was systematic genocide designed to prevent Guardian restoration by eliminating the genetic foundation that made it possible. "Then we finish this quickly," she said, allowing the grove's ancient power to flood her system with abilities she had never fully accessed. And we show the Alliance what happens when they threaten not just us, but everyone who carries the blood we're sworn to protect." The sacred grove responded to her commitment with power that had been waiting 3 centuries for a guardian queen worthy of its full support. Silver light erupted from every tree, ancient protections blazed to life with intensity that made the air itself burn with supernatural energy, and the very ground became a weapon that responded to her will. What had been a desperate defensive battle was about to become something far more devastating. The complete awakening of Guardian Queen abilities in a sacred space designed to amplify royal bloodline power beyond all recorded limitations. The Alliance had made a critical error in choosing this battleground. They were about to discover why the Grove of Moonhaven had never fallen to any enemy, no matter how overwhelming their numbers or sophisticated their tactics. The transformation began with pain that transcended anything in Lyra's experience. Not the sharp agony of injury or the dull ache of exhaustion, but something fundamental reshaping itself at the cellular level while her consciousness remained fully aware of every excruciating detail. Her bones began to elongate and restructure themselves with sounds like breaking branches. Her spine curved and stretched with vertebrae popping in rapid sequence, and her human form started dissolving into something magnificent and terrible. "Fight it!" Celeste shouted to her remaining soldiers as silver light erupted from Lyra's transforming body with intensity that made the grove's ancient trees sing in harmonic response. "Don't let the awakening complete. Kill her before she reaches full power." But the Grove of Moonhaven had waited 3 centuries for a guardian queen worthy of its protection, and it responded to the threat against its chosen heir with fury that made the very air burn with supernatural energy. Ancient roots erupted from the sacred ground to form barriers around Lyra's transforming form, while silver-barked trees moved to intercept crossbow bolts and weapons aimed at interrupting the awakening process. Through the mate bond, Kieran felt every moment of her transformation as if it were happening to his own body. The bone-deep restructuring, the expansion of consciousness to include senses beyond human comprehension, and the overwhelming flood of genetic memories that connected her to every guardian queen who had ever completed this sacred metamorphosis. "Lyra," he called, his voice carrying desperate love and unwavering support as he fought to protect her vulnerable form from Alliance soldiers who pressed their attack despite the Grove's supernatural defences. But she couldn't respond with words anymore. Her throat was changing, vocal cords restructuring themselves to produce sounds that could command elemental forces and communicate with supernatural beings across vast distances. When she tried to speak, what emerged was a harmonious note that made the Grove's silver trees resonate with power that had been dormant since the Great Suppression. The pain began shifting into something else as her transformation reached its critical phase. Not relief exactly, but a profound sense of rightness as her true form finally emerged from centuries of genetic suppression. Power flooded her system like liquid fire, rewriting her nervous system to handle abilities that no human body could contain, expanding her consciousness to encompass awareness that stretched far beyond the physical limitations she had always accepted as natural. Her eyes opened, and the world exploded into layers of perception that her human mind had never imagined possible. She could see the supernatural essence of every living thing in the Grove, Kieran blazing with Golden Alpha authority, the Alliance soldiers carrying artificial enhancements that looked like parasitic shadows attached to their life force, and most amazingly, the Grove itself revealing its true nature as a vast network of connected consciousness that had been guarding Guardian secrets for millennia. Through her enhanced senses, she could perceive the silver threads of connection that linked her to every suppressed Guardian bloodline across all the territories. 17 confirmed lines that Oracle Thane had identified were glowing like distant stars in her expanded awareness, but there were dozens more whose genetic potential pulsed with faint recognition that grew stronger as her awakened power reached across impossible distances to touch their sleeping heritage. "Impossible," breathed one of the Alliance soldiers, as her transformed presence sent waves of supernatural authority radiating outward from the sacred grove. Guardian queens were never supposed to be able to awaken other bloodlines remotely. But that was exactly what was happening. Through her completed transformation, Lyra could feel the genetic locks that had kept guardian abilities dormant for 3 centuries beginning to dissolve in response to her awakened call. Every person carrying suppressed bloodline heritage was experiencing the first stirrings of power that had been deliberately hidden from their awareness. "Stop her," Celeste commanded with desperate urgency as she realized the scope of what they were witnessing. "If she completes the bloodline awakening, we'll face 50 guardian families instead of one isolated girl." The Alliance soldiers pressed their attack with renewed fury, but they were no longer fighting just Lyra and Kieran. The Grove of Moonhaven itself had become their enemy, with ancient protections that turned every tree into a weapon and every root system into a trap designed to eliminate threats to guardian royalty. More than that, Lyra's awakened abilities were creating tactical advantages that transcended anything the Alliance had prepared for in their planning. She could perceive their attack patterns before they formed them, could manipulate the Grove's elemental forces to redirect their weapons, and most devastatingly, could target the artificial enhancements that gave their elite soldiers supernatural abilities. "Your power is stolen," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate with authority that every supernatural being present recognized as fundamental truth. "Alchemical enhancements drawn from creatures you've tortured and killed. Let me show you what real power feels like." Silver fire erupted from her transformed hands, not the destructive flame that would have killed her enemies outright, but something far more precise. Energy that specifically targeted artificial supernatural abilities and burned them away from the host bodies without causing permanent harm to the soldiers themselves. Within seconds, half the Alliance force found themselves reduced to baseline human capabilities, their enhanced speed and strength dissolving as Guardian Fire cleansed them of power they had never truly earned. "Surrender!" Kieran commanded, his alpha authority amplified by the mate bond to levels that made resistance physically painful for anyone without supernatural heritage of their own. "Your enhancements are gone, your tactical advantages are eliminated, and you're facing opponents whose abilities you fundamentally misunderstood." But Celeste's fury at witnessing her carefully planned operation dissolve into tactical disaster drove her beyond rational assessment of the situation. "If we can't stop the Guardian awakening," she snarled, drawing a weapon that blazed with malevolent energy, "then we'll make sure it dies with her." The blade she raised was not ordinary silver, but something far more dangerous. A suppression sword forged from metals that could permanently sever supernatural connections, designed specifically to kill Guardian Queens in ways that would prevent their power from passing to other bloodlines. The moment she struck, time seemed to slow as Lyra's enhanced perception mapped every detail of the attack with crystalline clarity. The suppression blade carried enough destructive energy to kill her instantly if it found its target. But her awakened abilities suggested defensive options that her human mind would never have conceived. Instead of dodging or blocking, she chose the most counterintuitive response possible. She reached out and grasped the blade with her transformed hands, allowing the suppression energy to flow through her awakened form, while her guardian heritage analysed its structure with supernatural precision. "You made this from guardian bones," she realised with horror that quickly transformed into incandescent rage. "From my ancestors who were executed during the Great Suppression?" The suppression sword had been forged from the remains of guardian queens who had died defending their people, their bones ground into powder and mixed with metals specifically chosen to destroy the supernatural abilities they had once carried. It was not just a weapon, it was desecration of the most sacred kind. "And it will serve the same purpose now," Celeste replied with bitter satisfaction as she poured more energy into the blade, expecting to see Lyra's awakened abilities dissolve under the weapon's suppression field. Instead, something unprecedented happened. Lyra's completed transformation allowed her to absorb the suppression energy and convert it back into the guardian power it had been designed to destroy. The ancestors' bones recognized their descendant and chose to empower her rather than eliminate her, turning the Alliance's most deadly weapon into fuel for abilities that transcended anything in recorded supernatural history. Power erupted from her transformed form with intensity that made the Grove of Moonhaven blaze with silver light visible for miles in every direction. Through the mate bond, Kieran felt his own abilities amplify beyond anything he had ever experienced, as Guardian Queen power flowed into their connection and enhanced his alpha authority to levels that approached the legendary partnerships of ancient times. "This is what you were trying to prevent," Lyra said, her voice carrying across the grove with harmonics that made every living thing pause in recognition of absolute supernatural authority. "This is what the Great Suppression was designed to eliminate, and this is why your efforts were always destined to fail." The suppression sword dissolved in her hands like mist, its artificial power unable to maintain cohesion against guardian abilities that had been awakened not just in her, but through her connection to bloodlines across every territory that had participated in the Great Suppression. Through her expanded awareness, she could feel the other awakening guardian lines responding to her call with power that had been waiting centuries for the right catalyst. 17 confirmed bloodlines were beginning their own transformations, while dozens of diluted lines were experiencing the first stirrings of abilities their families had never known they carried. The Alliance's plan to eliminate Guardian heritage through systematic assassination had triggered exactly the opposite result, a simultaneous awakening of supernatural power that would reshape the political landscape of every territory that had tried to suppress it. But as her transformation completed itself and her awareness expanded to encompass the full scope of what was happening across the supernatural world, Lyra realized that their victory in the Grove of Moonhaven was only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The Alliance had backup plans that extended far beyond what they had revealed in their ultimatum, and those plans were already being implemented as Guardian power returned to a world that had forgotten how to contain it. The aftermath of Lyra's complete awakening transformed the Grove of Moonhaven into a supernatural battlefield where mercy became the ultimate demonstration of power. The remaining Alliance soldiers lay scattered across the sacred ground, their stolen enhancements burned away by Guardian fire, their weapons dissolved by ancient magic that recognized no authority higher than royal bloodline heritage. Lady Celeste knelt among the silver-barked trees with her hands pressed against the earth, her body shaking from the psychic shock of witnessing power that transcended every assumption she had made about Guardian capabilities. The suppression sword that had been her final gambit was nothing but metallic dust scattered on the wind, its artificial strength no match for abilities that drew from sources older than recorded history. "Yield," Kieran commanded, his alpha authority amplified by the mate bond to levels that made resistance physically impossible for anyone without supernatural heritage of their own. "Your soldiers are defeated, your weapons are destroyed, and you're facing opponents whose abilities you fundamentally fail to understand." Through her enhanced awareness, Lyra could perceive the true scope of the battle they had just won. The Alliance strike teams, positioned across multiple territories to eliminate other Guardian bloodlines, were experiencing the same tactical disasters as awakened power manifested in response to her completed transformation. 17 confirmed bloodlines were beginning their own metamorphoses, while dozens of diluted lines were discovering abilities their families had never known they carried. But what struck her most profoundly was the choice she now faced, a decision that would define not just her own character, but the entire future of Guardian restoration. "Kill them," one of the Alliance soldiers whispered, his voice carrying the desperate acceptance of someone who expected no mercy from enemies he had tried to murder. "Make it quick. We knew the risks when we accepted this mission." Instead, Lyra moved through the grove with fluid grace that spoke of supernatural abilities perfectly integrated into conscious control. Her transformed presence radiated power that made the ancient trees sing in harmonic response, but more than that, it carried an authority that every living thing recognized as fundamentally benevolent. "Stand," she commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that made immediate obedience automatic rather than coercive. "All of you, look at me and understand what you are truly fighting." The Alliance soldiers struggled to their feet, their human limitations making even simple movement difficult after experiencing the psychic impact of witnessing abilities that exceeded their capacity to process. But they managed to meet her gaze, and what they saw there made several of them step back in obvious shock. Lyra's eyes blazed with silver fire that held no malice, no desire for vengeance, no satisfaction at their defeat. Instead, they carried the same compassionate authority that had allowed ancient guardian queens to rule through love rather than fear, through protection rather than domination. "You were told that guardian power threatened the balance of supernatural society," she said quietly. "You were taught that bloodline restoration would lead to tyranny and oppression. You believed that eliminating us was necessary to preserve freedom for everyone else." "It was," Celeste replied, with defiance that couldn't quite hide her growing uncertainty. "Guardian queens ruled absolutely during the ancient period. Their power was too great to coexist with democratic territorial governance." "This power," Lyra said, allowing her awakened abilities to manifest visibly around her transformed form, silver light that illuminated the grove without burning, supernatural authority that commanded respect without demanding submission, and most importantly, healing energy that began mending the injuries her enemies had sustained during their failed assault. The Alliance soldiers watched in stunned silence as Guardian Fire closed their wounds, restored their strength, and eliminated the lingering effects of artificial enhancement withdrawal. She was healing the very people who had tried to kill her, demonstrating mercy that transcended any political calculation they could understand. "Impossible," breathed one of the Alliance commanders. "Guardian power was supposed to be destructive, dominating. The historical records describe abilities that could level cities and reshape entire landscapes through raw force." "The historical records," Kieran said with quiet intensity, "were written by the victors of the Great Suppression. They emphasized Guardian Power's potential for destruction while ignoring its fundamental nature as protective rather than aggressive force." Through their enhanced mate bond, Lyra felt his understanding of what she was accomplishing with this demonstration of mercy. By choosing healing over vengeance, protection over punishment, she was proving that Guardian Restoration represented balance rather than tyranny, justice rather than oppression. "You have a choice," she told the Alliance forces with authority that carried absolute conviction. "Return to your territories and report what you witnessed here. Tell your leaders that Guardian Power serves life rather than death, creation rather than destruction. Or continue your campaign of elimination and face the consequences of opposing abilities that draw from sources you cannot comprehend or control." "And if we choose to report honestly about what we've seen?" Celeste asked, her political mind already calculating the implications of bringing news that would contradict everything the Alliance had believed about Guardian heritage. "Then you become part of the solution instead of obstacles to supernatural balance," Lyra replied. "Guardian restoration isn't about eliminating existing power structures. It's about restoring the complementary relationships that kept the supernatural world stable for centuries before fear and politics destroyed them." She gestured toward the grove of Moonhaven, where ancient protections continued to pulse with silver light in recognition of royal bloodline presence. This sacred space has been waiting 3 centuries for a guardian queen worthy of its protection, not because it craved violence or sought conquest, but because it understood that some powers exist to serve rather than to rule. The truth of that statement resonated through the grove with harmonic frequencies that made even the Alliance soldiers recognize its fundamental accuracy. The ancient magic surrounding them carried no malice, no desire for dominance, only the patient protection of something precious that had been lost and was finally being reclaimed. "What about the territorial accords?" one of the surviving Alliance commanders asked. "What about the political structures that have maintained peace for the past century?" "What peace?" Kieran asked with quiet challenge. The Eastern Territories have been in constant conflict over resource distribution. The northern borders see regular disputes over supernatural hunting rights. The Southern Alliance changes every few years as different factions vie for control. That's not peace, that's managed warfare. Through her expanded awareness, Lyra could sense the truth of his assessment. The world that had emerged from the Great Suppression wasn't stable. It was a collection of competing power structures held together by exhaustion rather than harmony, fear rather than mutual respect. Guardian Alpha partnerships created genuine stability, she explained, allowing her awakened abilities to demonstrate the complementary nature of their combined power. Not through dominance, but through balance. Not through fear, but through recognition that some connections transcend political convenience. The mate bond flared between them as she spoke, its intensity visible to everyone present as golden and silver light that wove together in patterns of perfect harmony. Even the Alliance soldiers could perceive that what connected her to Kieran wasn't about control or possession. It was about partnership that made both of them stronger without diminishing either individual identity. "The other awakening bloodlines," Celeste said with growing understanding. "You're not creating an army of guardian queens to dominate the territories. You're restoring partnerships that were designed to work with existing alpha leadership." Exactly. 17 guardian families awakening to support rather than replace current territorial authority. Abilities that enhance rather than compete with established power structures. Partnership that creates stability through cooperation rather than conquest through force. As the implications of what she was offering became clear, Lyra could see the Alliance forces beginning to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about guardian restoration. What they had been taught to fear as tyrannical power grab was revealing itself as an opportunity to restore balance that the supernatural world had been missing for 3 centuries. "We need time to process this," Celeste admitted with honesty that must have cost her considerable pride. "Time to reconcile what we've witnessed with what we believed we were fighting." "You have it," Lyra replied, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone whose power was now unquestionable, but whose character had chosen mercy over vengeance. "Return to your territories, consult with your leaders. Consider whether the Alliance truly benefits from eliminating capabilities that could enhance rather than threaten your existing authority." As the Alliance forces began their withdrawal from the Grove of Moonhaven, Lyra felt the broader implications of her choice settling into place, like destiny, finally aligning with conscious decision. By demonstrating mercy when vengeance would have been justified, by choosing healing when destruction would have been easier, she had proven that guardian power represented hope rather than threat. But the real test of that choice would come when the Alliance leadership decided how to respond to reports that contradicted everything they had believed about the nature of guardian restoration.